Now, how many of you at some point in your life have been called by your full name and it wasn't in a happy tone? Anybody? When I heard Marvin Glenn Cameron, I knew there was problems. Did you ever hear that in your, not my name, but did you ever hear your name, your full name, and you knew? How many of you parents have said a full name and you had evil in your hearts, huh? Anybody? So, sometimes we get a name. Sometimes it takes us a long time to outgrow a name. Maybe we're Jim's son or Jean's daughter. Or maybe the first 5 years I lived in Kingsport, I felt like my first name was new pastor. This is our new pastor, Marvin. It took 5 years to outgrow that. I want you to think about what it means to get a new name. What it means to get an adult name. Maybe you had a nickname as a child and you didn't like it. And finally, you went off to college where they didn't know you as Bubba or something like that, and you got to be your own name. In the Bible this morning, we're going to read from the Gospel of Mark, verses 13 through 18 of Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3 tells us about the calling of the disciples. So let's see what's on the screen there. Jesus went up on a mountainside and, it went away, and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. I think they were a tag team wrestling team before they became disciples. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot. 12 names. If you notice, if you read closely, 4 of them are notified that they're going to be known by their daddy's names. Did you ever notice that when you read that? 4 of the 12, their daddies must have been fairly well known. Son of. Maybe you've always been son of or daughter of, and maybe you've wanted your own name. Simon gets the name Petros, rock. And I wonder why Jesus gave him that name. I wonder if it was maybe to help him. Have you ever heard of a guy named Tommy Lasorda? Anybody remember Tommy Lasorda? Tommy Lasorda was the manager, very successful manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, very dramatic personality. And he was a master psychologist as a manager. And he had a kid in his system with the Dodgers that he saw tremendous potential with. But the kid just lacked the tenacity to be a major league pitcher. You've probably heard of him. His name was Orel Hershiser. Anybody ever heard of Orel Hershiser? Orel Hershiser became a magnificent pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers. But Lasorda saw that there was a timidity about him, that he lacked the fierceness to go up and throw against the old Cincinnati Reds and Pittsburgh Pirates and those great teams of yesteryear. And so Lasorda tried to figure out what will help Orel Hershiser become what he can become. So he gave him a nickname. And he went to Orel Hershiser. Now, I'm really not fond of Marvin, but I'm glad it's not Orel, I got to tell you. But he goes to Orel Hershiser and he says, your name is now Bulldog. Bulldog. That's your name. And that's what you're going to be known as in the Dodger organization. And over a period of time, it had an effect. And Orel Hershiser went from being a timid pitcher to one of the most intimidating, feared pitchers in the major leagues. Now, none of these folks are going to remember what I'm going to talk to you about. The rest of you will. You all know who Johnny Cash was. You remember a song Johnny Cash wrote about names? Anybody remember? Let me give you some of the lyrics. Well, my daddy left home when I was 3, and he didn't leave much to Ma and me, just this old guitar and an empty bottle of booze. Now, I don't blame him because he run and hid, but the meanest thing that he ever did was before he left, he went and named me what? There you go. And he said, son, this world is rough, and a man's going to make it, he's got to be tough. And I knew I wouldn't be there to help you along. So I give you a name, and I said goodbye. I knew you'd have to get tough or die. And it's that name that helped to make you strong. Then he uses some language I'm not going to use in the pulpit. And Johnny Cash ends the song and said, and if I ever have a son, I'm going to name him Bill or George, anything but Sue. Now, I didn't know the story of that song till recently. You know who wrote the song? Shel Silverstein. You probably know Shel Silverstein. Shel Silverstein wrote the song, and he wrote it about somebody else that became famous. He wrote it for a man whose name was Gene, Jean, Gene Shepard. Gene Shepard is the author of one of the most favorite Christmas movies of our time called A Christmas Story. Remember that, about the little boy who wanted a BB gun for Christmas? You think Gene Shepard's still working out some name issues when he wrote that movie? I don't know. But here's what I want to suggest to you, that when Jesus gave Peter that name, he was looking for some change. Sons of thunder, traitor, one of them is known as traitor. So here's the question I want to pose for you. Is it possible that Jesus is hoping the name will change Peter from what he is to what Jesus hopes he will become? See what I mean? Philippians chapter 1, Paul writes these words to the Christians in Philippi. The one who began a good work in you. Jesus had begun a good work in Simon, but he was going to have to become Petros. He's going to have to become rock before the good work can become all it is. And the second thing I want you to see that I think is very, very important is this. If we're going to be faithful disciples of Jesus, we need a new name. Now, it doesn't mean you have to change from Oral to Bulldog or from Sue to Bill or George, even though some folks do that. I read the other day, why do people change their names? The 3 top reasons people change their names, go to court, do legal things to change their names. Number 1 is, of course, marriage, right? Yeah. Number 2 is divorce. People change their names back. Number 3 is ethnicity. Either the name sounds too ethnic for people to blend into the culture. If you go back in our history of immigration, you see hundreds and thousands of people who change their names to anglicize them, to make them fit in. Other folks want to go back to their roots, and they change their names back to maybe where their native land was. 2 people I read about who changed their names rather dramatically. One of them, a guy named Steve Crusher. Steve Crusher, that's a cool name. I mean, if I was Steve Crusher, I wouldn't change it. But he wanted to communicate his belief in America, and so he changed his name from Steve Crusher to this: In God We Trust. Can you imagine having a checkbook that says, In God We Trust? Go to Walmart to get a check cashed. What is your name? In God We Trust. Another guy named Marvin, I don't blame him for changing his name. Marvin Richardson changed his name. He was an advocate for the pro-life movement. He changed his name to simply pro-life. Well, you know how it goes. Isaiah chapter 62, the prophet tells Israel, in due time, you will have a new name. So, what kind of a name would inspire you? If Jesus looked at you and said, you're the rock, would that inspire you? Would that make you think you're more than you are? The reality is, The reality is, once we become followers of Jesus, every one of us has a new name. The book of Acts tells us that in a place we call Turkey, there were a group of people who went there to escape the ravages going on with Christians in Jerusalem. It was a place called Antioch. It's a flourishing community of Christ followers. And the book of Acts tells us that it was there that they got a new name. And the new name was this: Little Christ. Little Christ, or as we call it, Christians. Little Christ. Sometimes we get a name change, and I'm sure Oral Hershiser wasn't always a bulldog. I'm sure when he looked down the plate at some of those big, strong, hulking batters in the National League, he felt more like a Chihuahua than a bulldog. And sometimes we don't always live up to the name. Simon Peter didn't, did he? The night before the crucifixion. The night before the crucifixion. Simon Peter loses it. Forgets everything he'd ever loved. Forgets all the courage he'd ever summoned. And in the 21st chapter of John, we're going to look at in a few weeks, in the 21st chapter of John, Jesus meets him. The risen Jesus meets him by the seashore. And when he does, he doesn't call him Rock. He looks at him and says, Simon, Simon, do you love me? I think there's something pretty profound there. Maybe Peter's gone 2 steps forward and 5 back. Maybe right now he's not Rock. He's just back to being Simon. Now, I got to tell you, the rest of the Bible tells us from that point on he's back to being Rock. But in that moment, his characteristics were of the old person and not the new. And I think there's something instructive there for us. I think as Christians, all of us sometimes take 2 steps forward and 3 or 4 or 5 back. And sometimes I don't bear the name Little Christ as well as I'd like to. And sometimes if he met me, he might not even say Little Christ to me. He might just look at me with my mama's voice and say, Marvin Glenn Cameron, what do you think you're doing? But then Peter gets to be Rock again. Here's what I want to ask you. You've got a new name if you're a follower of Jesus. The question is, are you wearing it well? If somebody sees you in the community, do they see you as a follower of Jesus, as a little Christ, or are you just that same old used to be?